100 people, different ages, different countries, different lives. Some were in operating rooms, some were underwater, some were alone in a field, far from anyone who could reach them in time. None of them knew each other. And yet, when researchers sat down and listened, really listened, to what each of them described, something strange emerged. The same tunnel, the same light, the same sensation of leaving the body and watching from above, the same feeling that time had stopped, or that it no longer meant anything. And the voices they recognized, people who had died years before, waiting there, as if they'd been expecting them. 100 people, one pattern, not similar, not almost the same, identical. That's what this is about. Not a theory, not a belief system, not a promise of heaven or a warning about hell, just the pattern. Because once you see it, once you really sit with what these people described, something shifts inside you. And it doesn't shift back. The first serious attempt to document near-death experiences at scale happened in the 1970s. Raymond Moody, a philosopher who had trained as a medical doctor, spent years collecting accounts from people who had been resuscitated after clinical death. He interviewed more than 100 individuals. He expected variation. He expected cultural noise, personal distortion, the usual mess of human memory under extreme stress. What he found was something else entirely. People who had never met, who lived in different states, who came from different religious backgrounds or no religious background at all, they kept describing the same sequence, not just similar elements, the same sequence in the same order with the same emotional texture. Moody published his findings in 1975. The book was called Life After Life. The medical community responded with skepticism, sometimes ridicule. But the accounts kept coming. Researchers at hospitals began noticing it independently. Cardiologists, anesthesiologists, nurses who worked night shifts in intensive care units and had learned, over years, to listen differently. The pattern wouldn't go away. By the 1980s, Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, had developed the first standardized scale for measuring the depth of a near-death experience. He called it the NDE scale. It allowed researchers to compare accounts across populations in a way that hadn't been possible before. His findings confirmed Moody's, and then added something new. The deeper the experience, the higher someone scored on Ring's scale, the more likely they were to report a specific cluster of elements. Not just the tunnel and the light, something more particular. A moment of life review in which every action the person had ever taken was experienced simultaneously, not just remembered, but felt, including the effect of those actions on others. A boundary, a threshold they were told, or somehow understood, they could not cross, and a return they did not choose. Ring interviewed hundreds of people over years of structured research. He noted something that troubled him, in the way that only genuinely strange data can trouble a careful scientist. The people who had been blind since birth, blind from birth with no visual memory whatsoever, no framework for what seeing even meant, they came back describing light, not darkness, not an absence of sensation, light and shapes, and faces they recognized but had never seen. That single finding is worth sitting with for a moment, because it suggests that whatever was being experienced during these events, It wasn't the brain reconstructing familiar imagery from stored memory. It wasn't fear producing hallucinations shaped by cultural expectation. It was something that appeared to function independently of the physical apparatus we use to perceive the world. And it kept happening. Across cultures, across decades, across every disciplined attempt to explain it away, the accounts multiplied. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Collected by hospitals, by university research programs, by organizations like IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, that had formed specifically because the data had grown too large, too consistent, and too structurally coherent to be dismissed without consequence. Researchers began to notice something else alongside all of this, something quieter, but in some ways more unsettling than the accounts themselves. The people who had these experiences didn't come back the same, not just emotionally changed, though that was almost universal. Something more fundamental had shifted in them. Their relationship to fear, their relationship to time, the way they held the concept of death, which had once been an abstraction and was now something they had been inside of and returned from, carrying something they couldn't name precisely, but also couldn't put down. Some described it as a weight, some described it as a gift. Most couldn't find a single word for it and eventually stopped trying. What no one had fully reckoned with yet was the question underneath all of it, not whether these experiences were real, but what it meant that they were all the same. To understand why the pattern matters, you have to understand what researchers were actually looking for when they started comparing accounts. The assumption, the reasonable, scientifically defensible assumption, was that near-death experiences would look different depending on who was having them. A devout Catholic would see the Virgin Mary. A Buddhist might describe dissolution into light. A secular person with no religious framework would describe something more abstract, neurons firing, or the brain's last electrical surge before shutdown. That is what the data should have shown. It didn't. What it showed instead was a structure, a consistent architecture of experience that appeared regardless of the person's beliefs, background, age, or the specific medical event that had brought them to the threshold. Researchers began calling these the core elements. Over decades of careful comparison, they settled on a list that has remained remarkably stable. The first is peace, not relief. Peace. A quality of stillness that most people describe as unlike anything they had ever felt inside a living body. One woman who had flatlined during cardiac arrest said it this way: "I didn't feel the absence of pain, I felt the absence of the idea that pain had ever been possible." The second is separation from the body, a clear, perceptual experience of observing the physical self from outside it. In a significant number of cases, people described specific, verifiable details from rooms they were not conscious in, details they could not have known, the position of a piece of equipment, a conversation between doctors, the color of a nurse's shoes. The third is moving through darkness toward light, frequently dismissed as cultural conditioning, the tunnel, the light at the end, the sense of being drawn forward. But the dismissal doesn't hold because the element appears in accounts from cultures with no equivalent imagery. From children too young to have absorbed the cultural narrative. From people who reported it before Moody's book made the image part of public consciousness at all. The fourth is encountering other beings, not generic presences, specific, recognized individuals, people who had died before the experiencer, appearing with a quality that every person describes in one form or another as more real than anything they had felt in waking life. More real than this. That phrase surfaces again and again across the accounts. More real, not vivid, not clear. Real in a way that made ordinary experience feel afterward like the approximation, like the thin copy of something that had an original somewhere else. The fifth is the boundary, the point at which the person understood, without being told, or sometimes by being told directly, that they had reached a threshold they could not cross, that something on the other side of it was permanent, and that they were being returned. Not given a choice, returned. This is the detail researchers found most consistent and most difficult to account for within conventional frameworks, because it carries a quality of agency that doesn't belong to the person having the experience. Someone or something decided, and the person came back carrying that knowledge, the knowledge that there had been a moment, precise, absolute, unmistakable, when it had not been up to them. There is a quality to that specific awareness that is hard to convey second-hand. People who have been through it don't speak about it the way they speak about a memory. They speak about it the way you speak about something you were shown, something demonstrated rather than imagined, a fact about the nature of things placed in front of them that the waking mind could rationalize but never fully dismiss. That is what researchers kept encountering account after account, year after year. Not memory, not vision, knowledge, something that transferred, something that remained. And the question underneath all of it, the one that stayed long after the last file was closed, transferred from where? There is a cardiologist named Pim van Lommel. He practiced in the Netherlands for decades. He was not a man given to mysticism. He was methodical, precise, the kind of physician who trusted what could be measured and was appropriately skeptical of what couldn't. In 1969, a patient of his was resuscitated after cardiac arrest. The man woke and described in careful detail an experience that Van Lommel had no framework for. He filed it away. He didn't know what to do with it. Then it happened again, and again. Over the following years, Van Lommel quietly began collecting accounts from patients who had been resuscitated in his ward. By the 1980s, he had enough to understand that what he was seeing was not random. It had a shape, the same shape, whether the patient was 30 or 70, whether they believed in God or had never once considered the question. He designed a study. A prospective study, meaning patients were enrolled before their cardiac arrest, not interviewed afterward in a way that could allow selection bias to distort the results. Between 1988 and 1992, he and his colleagues at 10 Dutch hospitals collected data from 344 patients resuscitated after cardiac arrest. All of them were, by clinical definition, dead for a period of time. No heartbeat, no measurable brain activity. 62 of them, 18%, reported a near-death experience. 18% sounds modest until you understand the clinical conditions. These patients were not sedated and dreaming. They were not at the hypnagogic edge of sleep. They were in full cardiac arrest, in a state our best instruments registered as the complete absence of the brain function we associate with conscious experience. And yet, 18% came back with structured, coherent accounts, experiences that followed the pattern, the peace, the separation from the body, the movement toward light, the beings they recognized, the boundary they could not cross. Van Lommel published his findings in The Lancet in 2001. The Lancet is not a fringe journal. It is one of the oldest and most respected medical publications in the world. The paper was peer-reviewed, scrutinized, challenged from multiple directions, and it held. The finding that generated the most sustained discomfort among his peers was not the frequency of the experiences, it was the content. Because some of these patients, not all, but enough to matter, described verifiable perceptions from the period when they were clinically dead. Things they saw, conversations they overheard, specific details confirmed afterward by the medical staff who were present in the room, details that should have been impossible to perceive without a functioning brain. One patient described watching a nurse remove his dentures and place them in a specific drawer during resuscitation. He described the nurse's face. He described the room from an elevated vantage point he had never occupied while conscious. When he woke, he asked for his dentures back. The nurse confirmed every detail. Van Lommel spent years afterward grappling with what the data meant, not as a believer, but as a scientist trained to follow evidence wherever it led, including into territory he would never have chosen to enter on his own. He said eventually that the findings required him to take seriously a possibility he had spent his career assuming was not worth considering. That consciousness might not be produced by the brain, that it might be something the brain receives or accesses or temporarily houses, the way an antenna houses a signal it did not generate and cannot create on its own, and that death might be, in some sense he couldn't yet fully articulate, a change in reception, not the end of the signal. That is where the science arrived. In 2001, in one of the most rigorously reviewed medical journals on Earth. Not at a conclusion, not at proof, at a question it could no longer pretend wasn't there. And once a question of that size enters the room, placed there by data, not by faith, not by hope, it is very difficult to ask it to leave. It tends to stay. It tends to grow. The skeptics had answers. They always had answers. Hypoxia. The brain starved of oxygen, generating hallucinations as it shuts down. REM intrusion. Dream states bleeding into moments of crisis. Endorphin floods. Temporal lobe activity. The dying brain's last chemical performance, mistaken for something transcendent by a mind too frightened to think clearly. These are not foolish explanations. They deserve to be taken seriously, and for a time they were enough to contain the data. Then the data stopped cooperating. The hypoxia argument has a problem. Hypoxic hallucinations, the experiences produced by oxygen deprivation, are chaotic, fragmented, and often terrifying. They don't follow a consistent structure. They don't produce the sustained, profound peace that NDE accounts describe again and again. They don't leave people transformed in the same direction, with the same cluster of lasting changes, independent of culture or background. The REM intrusion theory has a problem. REM intrusion produces experiences that feel confusing and disconnected from waking reality. NDEs produce the opposite, experiences that feel more real than waking reality. People who have had both describe them as completely unlike each other. The temporal lobe argument has a problem. Electrical stimulation of the temporal lobe produces brief, fragmented sensations, a smell, a sound, a flash of unconnected memory. Not the coherent, structured, narrative journey that NDE accounts describe, not the life review in which every action is felt from both directions simultaneously, not the boundary, not the recognized being who says something specific and true that can later be verified, but the deepest problem, the one that none of the neurological explanations can fully account for, is the veridical element, veridical perception, the perception of things that were actually there, actually said, actually done in the physical room during the period when the patient had no measurable brain activity. You cannot hallucinate a fact you didn't know. You cannot dream your way to a specific detail, a drawer, a shoe, a word spoken quietly between two nurses in a corridor, and then have that detail confirmed by independent witnesses. This is not a matter of belief or interpretation. It is a matter of basic evidentiary logic. If the experience were purely internal, the brain talking to itself in its final moments, there would be no mechanism by which it could produce accurate information about the external world. The data would be internal only. It would not match the room. And yet, in case after documented case, it matched the room. Researchers began designing studies specifically to test this. Target images, cards with patterns printed on them, placed face down in positions only visible from an elevated vantage point above the operating table. If a patient reported leaving their body and floating upward, could they describe what the card showed? The studies were imperfect. Results were mixed. Some were negative. Others produced findings that were genuinely difficult to dismiss. What the design itself reveals, the fact that researchers were placing cards on high shelves in cardiac wards, hoping someone would die and come back and tell them what was written there, is how seriously the question had become. This was no longer a philosophical debate conducted in comfortable academic rooms. It had entered the domain of experiment, of measurable test, of the careful, unglamorous, methodical work that science undertakes when it suspects something might actually be real. And underneath all of it, underneath the hypoxia debates and the REM arguments and the veridical studies, one question remained that no neurological model had answered. Why the same pattern? In every culture, in every decade, in every person, regardless of what they believed before they crossed the threshold? If this was the brain creating something from nothing, if it was purely internal, purely chemical, purely the product of a frightened mind filling silence with imagery, then why did every brain tell the same story? That is the question that the data kept returning to, and it had no clean answer yet. There is something that happens to people after they come back that the research literature calls the after effects. And in some ways, the after effects are more consistent than the experiences themselves, more consistent and harder to explain away. People who return from a deep near-death experience, regardless of their age, their background, their beliefs, or the circumstances of the event, tend to change in the same direction. Not in small ways, in fundamental ways, ways that their families and close friends notice, ways that persist not for weeks, but for decades. The fear of death diminishes. In many cases, it disappears entirely. Not because the person has argued themselves into a new belief about what happens next, but because they feel, with a certainty they describe as bodily rather than intellectual, that they have already been to the place death leads. And it was not what they had feared. One man who had a cardiac arrest at 53 described it this way. He said that before his experience, death was like a locked room at the end of a long hallway, dark, silent, unknowable. Every year of his adult life, he had walked a little closer to it. After his experience, he said the room had been opened. He had been inside it, and it was not what the hallway had promised. The second consistent after effect is a shift in priorities so fundamental that it frequently disrupts the person's existing life. Careers abandoned, relationships ended, not out of cruelty, but because they had become hollow in a way the person could no longer pretend wasn't there. New commitments made to things long set aside. Not as a resolution, not as a midlife correction, but as an adjustment so deep it felt less like a decision and more like a recognition. I didn't decide to change, one woman said. I came back different. My life had to catch up. The third after effect is a deepened sensitivity to other people, an increased capacity for compassion that those around them frequently describe noticing before they are told anything about what happened. Something changed in the quality of attention. Something became more patient, more present, more capable of staying with another person's pain without flinching or moving away. The fourth is a complicated relationship with the world as it is now, with noise, with hurry, with the quality of most human conversation which suddenly seems to hover at a surface the person has learned to see through. Many report periods of profound isolation in the months after returning. Not depression, though it can look like depression from outside, something closer to the disorientation of having been somewhere vast and then finding yourself back in a small room trying to remember what the furniture had meant to you before. The fifth is a persistent, quiet sense that there is something they are supposed to do, something unfinished that the return made them responsible for. They often cannot name it precisely, but the feeling doesn't leave. What is remarkable about these after effects is not simply that they exist, it is that they cluster, they travel together reliably across vastly different people and vastly different events. A drowning in Ohio, a surgery in Tokyo, a cardiac arrest in London, a fever in rural Georgia in the middle of August. The same changes, in the same proportions, moving in the same direction. If the near-death experience was simply a hallucination, a random electrical storm in a frightened brain, you would not expect the aftershocks to be consistent. Hallucinations don't reorganize personalities in uniform ways. They don't produce the same lasting transformation in a 50-year-old cardiac patient and a 6-year-old child who fell through the ice. Whatever happened to these people happened to something deep enough that the entire surface of their lives rearranged itself around it. That is the part of the pattern that researchers found most difficult to minimize, not the tunnels, not the light, the people who came back, who they were before, and who they were after. Those two things were not the same, and the distance between them was not random. It was, in every case, the same distance, traveled in the same direction. There is a question that surfaces eventually in every serious conversation about near-death experiences. It comes from a reasonable place. It sounds, at first, like a way of finally settling the matter. The question is, couldn't this all be cultural? Couldn't the pattern be explained by the fact that most of the early researchers were Western, and most of the accounts they collected came from Western patients, people who had absorbed the same images, the same stories, the same unconscious templates for what dying was supposed to look like. People who had grown up with the same religious vocabulary, the same literary tradition, the same quiet cultural inheritance about light and tunnels and what waits on the other side. It is a fair question, and it was answered. Not quickly, not without considerable effort, but it was answered. Researchers began specifically seeking accounts from outside the Western tradition. From India, where the god of death in Hindu mythology, Yamraj, presides over a judgment of souls that has nothing to do with tunnels of white light. From indigenous communities in North America. From Japan, where the cultural architecture surrounding death and what follows is built from entirely different material. What they found, when they examined those accounts carefully, was that the surface imagery varied. The being at the boundary might be described in different terms. The visual language of the threshold reflected the experiencer's own cultural vocabulary. The names were different. The clothing was different. The specific figures sometimes shifted, but the structure held peace, separation from the body, movement toward light. The encounter with recognized beings, the boundary that could not be crossed, the return without choice. In every tradition, in every century that researchers could reach through historical records, the same architecture underneath the different surfaces. There is a researcher named Alan Keller here, a sociologist who spent years doing exactly this work, a systematic cross-cultural survey of near-death accounts from non-Western and pre-modern sources. His conclusion, after years of comparison, was unambiguous. The core elements appear universally. No cultural tradition has a monopoly on them. They appear in records that predate the modern medical context by centuries, by millennia. Medieval European accounts, ancient Egyptian texts, accounts from classical Greece, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is not a religious text in the Western sense, but a detailed practical guide to the states encountered after death, describes a sequence that bears deep structural resemblance to what contemporary NDE researchers have documented from hospital wards, a clear light encountered immediately after death, a recognition, a life review of some form, a threshold, a decision point that is not the dying person's to make. This text was written more than 1,000 years before Raymond Moody was born. The cultural argument requires you to believe that a Tibetan monk in the 12th century and a retired schoolteacher in Ohio in 1987 and a child in a rural Indian village absorbed the same unconscious template from the same cultural source. It requires a transmission chain that doesn't exist. The pattern is older than the culture, which means one of two things. Either human beings, across all times, all places, all languages and belief systems, share a deep neurological structure that generates the same vision at the threshold of death. A biological hallucination so ancient and so consistent, it might as well be instinct. Or the pattern is consistent because what it describes is real. Because the place it points to does not vary the way cultural artifacts vary, for the same reason that a mountain looks like a mountain to everyone who climbs it, regardless of what language they speak when they come back down and try to describe what they saw. Researchers spent decades arguing between those two explanations, and while they argued, the accounts kept arriving. 100, 1,000, 10,000. All of them in the end pointing in the same direction. All of them, when you read closely enough, describing the same place. There is a woman named Anita Moorjani. In 2006, she was dying. Not slowly, not ambiguously. She was in the final hours of a 4-year battle with lymphoma that had spread through her body to the point where her organs were beginning to shut down. Her husband rushed her to a hospital in Hong Kong. The medical team who received her documented what they found. Tumors throughout her lymphatic system, her body filling with fluid. A coma deepening through the night as her family gathered and began to understand what was happening. Her doctors told her family to say goodbye. What Anita describes from that night is consistent with the pattern in every structural detail: the separation from the body, the expanded awareness, not a narrowing, as you might expect from a brain losing oxygen, but a widening, a sense of perceiving more clearly and more completely than she ever had while healthy. The encounter with her father, who had died years earlier, and with a close friend, both of whom communicated something to her, not in words exactly, but in a transfer of understanding she describes as immediate and complete, the way you know something in a dream before anyone has spoken. And then the boundary, the moment at which she understood that she could continue forward or return. She says her father told her it was not her time, that if she went back, her body would heal. She chose to return. Within 4 days of coming out of the coma, her tumors had begun to shrink at a rate her medical team had no framework for. Within 5 weeks, her doctors could find no evidence of cancer. The case was documented. Oncologists who reviewed the timeline described it as one of the most remarkable, spontaneous remissions they had encountered in practice. Her scans were published. The sequence of events was verified by the medical record. This is the element of her account that draws both the most skepticism and the most careful attention, because it sits at the intersection of two phenomena that science has no clean framework for connecting: the near-death experience and the spontaneous regression of late-stage cancer. Two events that, by every conventional model, should have nothing to do with each other, occurring in the same body within the same week. Moorjani herself doesn't claim to understand the mechanism. She speaks about it with a precision that is almost clinical. What she observed, what she was told, what her body did afterward. She does not embellish. She does not reach beyond what she experienced directly. When pressed on what she believes happened, she says this: she came back without fear, and she believes, she cannot prove, but she believes that the fear had been part of what was killing her. That is not a scientific statement, but it is a deeply human one. And it raises a question that medicine has circled for decades without resolution. How deep does the relationship between consciousness and the body actually go? Is there a threshold at which the state of one can act on the other in ways that our current models simply have no room for? These are not fringe questions. They are being asked in serious research environments by careful people with real institutional support behind them. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow us every day. Stories like these, documented, witnessed, impossible to fully explain, are exactly what this channel exists for, leave a comment below and tell me. Have you, or has someone you love, experienced something that changed everything? I read everyone. And now, one more thing, because Anita's case is not the end of what the pattern reveals. In some ways, it is only the beginning of the hardest question the data raises, because Morjani is not the only case of this kind. There are others. Other documented remissions following NDEs, not enough to establish statistical certainty, but enough to make the question impossible to set aside. What came back with them? What does it mean that the place they returned from appears to have a relationship with the living body that we have barely begun to understand? And what does it mean that every single person who went there described the same place? 100 people. That's where we started. And here at the end, that number feels small, because we know now that it was never really about the number. It was about what the number kept pointing to. Every researcher who spent serious time with this material arrived, eventually, at the same quiet place. Not certainty, not proof. Something more unsettling than either of those things. The sense that the question underneath all of it, the oldest question human beings have carried since the first person lost someone they loved, might not be as settled as the world had agreed to pretend. What happens after we die? Not as theology, not as consolation, as a question that the data had earned the right to ask again, carefully, without flinching, without the noise of belief or disbelief drowning out what was actually in front of us. The pattern does not prove anything. The researchers who worked most rigorously with this material are the first to say so. Van Lommel says so. Ring said so. Moody, who started all of it, has always been careful to hold the question open rather than force it toward a conclusion the evidence cannot yet fully support. But the pattern does something that proof cannot always do. It accumulates. It persists. It refuses, across 50 years of sustained scrutiny from some of the most skeptical minds in academic medicine, to become something smaller or more comfortable. And there is something in that refusal that deserves to be sat with, not argued over, not filed under coincidence or cultural contamination or the brain's last chemical performance, not explained away with the next available theory before the previous one has even been tested, just sat with, in quiet, for a moment, because you are still here, not because someone made you stay, not because you wandered in by accident and remained out of passive habit. You are here at the end of this because something in you already suspected that this question was not closed, because some part of you, the part that goes quiet at funerals, the part that has lain awake wondering, the part that has felt, at least once, that the person who died was somehow still present in a way that reason can't quite account for. Recognize something in these accounts, not as information, as confirmation. The 100 people in this study didn't know each other. They came from different decades, different cities, different lives, different beliefs, and in some cases no belief at all, about what waited on the other side of the threshold they crossed, and every single one of them came back describing the same place. That is not nothing. That is, quietly, one of the most extraordinary findings in the long history of human inquiry into its own nature. 100 independent witnesses with nothing to gain, and often something real to lose by speaking, all pointing in the same direction. All returning with the same thing they could not name, but also could not put down. If you have lost someone, if you have sat in a room after a death and felt the absence as a physical weight in the air, if you have ever found yourself talking to someone who was no longer there and paused in the middle of it and wondered whether some part of the transmission was still reaching, then this is for you. Not as an answer. Answers would be too clean, too easy, too much like the comfort that this kind of grief does not actually need. This is something quieter. It is the 100 voices speaking from the same place, telling you what they found there and leaving the rest to you. If this reached something in you, please follow the channel. Share this video with someone who needs it, not to convince them of anything, but because some things are lighter when carried in 2 pairs of hands. Leave a comment. Tell me what this stirred in you. Tell me about your own experience, if you have one, or tell me what story you'd like to hear next. This community is built from exactly that, from the people who came back and the people who are still listening for them. We'll be here